Explain what happened with State Department spokesperson PJ Crowley. He came to MIT. Who was he addressing?
As I understand it, PJ Crowley was addressing a crowd of students at MIT during a semi-private event. And he was asked about Bradley Manning's conditions of confinement. And he said it was ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. And when he was asked if this was on the record, he said yes. When this was reported by bloggers that were at the event, it took off in the media, U.S. and abroad. I was in London when I heard about it on Al Jazeera. And then a few days later, PJ Crowley was forced to resign by the Obama White House.
What do you think of what he said?
Well, I think he was spot on. I think that PJ Crowley, for that moment, was being very perceptive and was being very honest about his perceptions. And that kind of openness about policy in Washington is very rare these days, very rare. I mean, if the WikiLeaks cables have taught us nothing, it's that deception is the currency used on Capitol Hill. And so for Crowley to come out and say something that true and that honest, I think was quite good to see, quite refreshing.
Do you think Bradley Manning was tortured in prison?
I think that he was put under solitary confinement for some 8 months, that he underwent sensory deprivation, and he was denied access to visitors and exercise. I think that, I feel, as many do, that this constitutes torture, yes. John McCain, the U.S. Senator, has said at his time in solitary confinement that it was worse than any form of physical torture he ever had to endure. The EU Human Rights Court is currently considering banning extradition from the EU to the U.S. based on the fact that the U.S. does implement solitary confinement in prisons such as Quantico and in Leavenworth. So, yes, I feel you can make the case that this is torture, and from what I saw of Bradley Manning and his deterioration, I would say definitely what he underwent was torture.
Does it make you afraid for yourself?
In what regard?
The possibility of you being imprisoned like this.
Not really. I think that we're well past the point where people should be afraid. I think that everyone's kind of been living under this culture of fear in the States for some time now, been manifesting itself in different ways, most recently in us as citizens giving up our power, ceding our power to a state that is growing very large and that is threatening to take away even more of our power if we do not listen to it, if we do not kind of bow down and say, okay, that's fine. This culture of fear is something that must be combated against, and the only way to do that is to take a very firm, principled stand as a U.S. citizen and say, no, as a democracy, the citizens have rights, and we will fight to defend those rights. I think that if what I'm doing is activism, I have nothing to worry about, and if what I'm doing is called civil disobedience, then I feel that civil disobedience actually does restore some measure of dignity to the people, and thus in times like this may be necessary. So am I afraid? No, not at all. And if I am afraid, it takes managing that fear to move forward. And I would encourage every U.S. citizen to manage their fears and do what they can, take a firm, principled stand here, because everyone's an activist now.
What has most surprised you over this last year?
How frantic and, what's what I'm looking for, incompetent the U.S. government has been in prosecuting this investigation. Julian Assange said yesterday during the event that silence from powerful institutions is a show of strength. So if you step over ants and you crush a few of them and the ants protest, you don't feel the need to address the ants, you keep moving. In this circumstance, we've seen the U.S. government do everything it can to kind of tell the media, no, 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 we're the good guys, while at the same time, in the background, torturing Bradley Manning, seizing the computers of activists, and doing all manner of horrible atrocities to try to cover up the disclosures from WikiLeaks. I think this shows that the institutions that are perpetrating these crimes are, in fact, weak, and that we as the U.S. people have the responsibility to put some pressure on these institutions, to encourage them to change their policies, and to take a firm stand, because the U.S. government's ham-fist investigation shows that it is weak in its prosecution of this affair, and that if we push hard enough, things will change.
Do you think WikiLeaks has changed the world?
Oh, definitely. I mean, no one will say that we do not live in a post-WikiLeaks world. There was this realization last December, after all this stuff was released, that, oh my God, things are changed forever, for better or for worse. And I think that we are a world walking into a connected age. We are a people, as a species, who have never dealt with this degree of connectedness before in our society. And this is going to do very interesting things, not just to the economic sphere, which it already has, but also to the political sphere as well. And WikiLeaks is one of the first steps in this process. So, I don't know. I think that yes, WikiLeaks has changed the world, but it's more part of this organic process of changing the world. Technology is taking us to a level we've never been at before, and WikiLeaks is part of this, and our democracy will benefit from it.
Can you tell me anything about your family?
Sure. So my grandfather was a detective in Birmingham, Alabama, during the civil rights events happening in the 1960s. And he was one of the only King supporter on the department, in the Birmingham Police Department. He was a detective his whole life. And he actually gave the notebooks to King that King used to write letters from the Birmingham jail. So my grandfather said that King initially was using the margins of his newspaper to write an essay. And my grandfather noticed this, went out to a drugstore and bought him a notebook, came back and gave it to him that he would later use to write letters from the Birmingham jail. My grandfather's job on the police department was to essentially make sure that the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, was not hurting King supporters in and around the Birmingham area, and ensure that peace was being kept to a very large degree. And I've read through my grandfather's journals, and it's very interesting actually seeing this principled man who grew up in the middle of Alabama during the civil rights era, who actually undergoes this kind of mental transformation while he's on the department, saying that when King said justice delayed is justice denied, that was very pivotal for him. It was a phrase that caught like fire amongst him and others in the department, and really started their support for King in the civil rights era. So I wore my grandfather's ring as a reminder to me what people can do when they take a very principled stand. I feel that my grandfather's actions in the police department were a symbol for others to be King supporters, or to treat those more fairly that were imprisoned during the civil rights era. And I hope that I can live up to those principles in my everyday life as a U.S. citizen.
The Birmingham church bombing?
Yes. My grandfather was the lead investigator on the Birmingham church bombing that killed the 4 young girls in Birmingham, Alabama. It was a racially motivated bombing. The Klan had planted dynamite under the steps of a Baptist church, and they had thought that they were going to blow up an empty church, but there were 4 young girls practicing for a choir inside the church that were killed. This was had a very huge impact on my grandfather and others in the department.
I mean, they couldn't have thought they weren't going to hurt anyone because it went off Sunday morning.
Oh, really? Interestingly enough. Okay, interesting. The line that was in the U.S., that was in the Alabama media at the time, as I understand it, was that they thought they weren't going to hurt anyone, right? But there again, the Klan had a very large influence in Alabama during this time. Reading through my grandfather's notes and all the papers about the case that our family has access to, it's very interesting actually seeing him go through this investigation. The way he talks about the affairs happening between the Klan and King supporters in the Birmingham area, you get the feeling that it was a city on the brink. It was a city on the edge, almost like a war zone, and things were ready to break out at any time. And it's interesting. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been in his shoes during that time and actually be a King supporter in the middle of all this, behind enemy lines, as it were.
Did he have many friends in the Birmingham Police Department?
Oh, he did. He was there for many, many years.
What was his name?
Maurice House. Maurice House was his name, and I'm David Maurice House, named after him. But yeah, he was a very principled man. He died when I was very young. So I probably projected some of my idealism onto him, obviously, as people tend to do. But it's very, very remarkable reading his stories and actually coming to know him and his principles just through that. It's been very nice.
I'm trying to turn this off.
But he really gave me he was the one who instilled in me the idea that principles are very important for someone to live their life, you know.
How old were you when he?
When he died? I was 12, I think. But I mean, he really taught me that without principles, you don't really have a leg to stand on, right? And in our government now, you see people complete abdication of principles, whatever those principles may be.